Hey there hunters, welcome back to the Gunners Guild for another round of Remnant 2 build videos as we have a new update, which means we have a new meta shakeup, so we have to actually update some of the older builds and make newer ones. With that said, today we're going to talk about some of the ranged builds by giving a brief update on my previous ranged builds done so you can know what's changed or removed in those builds. Then we're going to cover two new builds per the usual, so this video is going to be a little bit longer. So let's start out with the build changes from our previously established builds. Starting with the artisanal chef itself, the Hunter Invader Artful Dodger build. No changes here. I did want to bring it back up though, since it was the first build I did for DLC3, and now that bosses no longer trigger empathy on our dodges, it's much better in boss rush. It's still extremely tanky, with Shielded Heart being able to throw by Redeemer, which gives you full shield whenever you want. That also got buffed. Redeemer's a bit better now. Nightfall's Dreadwalker form granting us Leech and being harder to hit, and Void Cloak giving us free dodges on top of like our natural Leech that we're gonna have. And then we also have our Invader decoys whenever you want, and Void Cloak. Like, it's just very, very tanky and safe, and it's really hard to die with it, to be honest. It's not the best DPS, you're only going to push about 5 or 6k, but I still recommend it. It's a really good entry level build if you want to learn kind of how to dodge and where to dodge, because you're going to get hit, especially if you have Void Cloak on. You'll be able to see where you get hit because you'll just auto dodge, and it's really good for practice. Next up, we have the automatic HuGs build, which is also featuring Nightfall because it's the best weapon in the game. Of course, you can still run this with like Corrupted Savior or any automatic weapon you'd like, but Nightfall has too many upsides: infinite ammo, 10% leech, harder to hit. It's just too good. So on this setup though, we changed from running Nebula as our offhand to the Corrupted Rune Pistol with Fetid Wounds. Reason being is that the main reason why we were using Nebula, besides trash clear, was for the corrosion extra damage, and it was just fire and forget. So with Rune Pistol, we still get 10% damage boost thanks to the Deathmark mod, which lasts like 30 seconds by the way. It's really long. And we can also get corrosion via Fetid Wounds. So when we drop out of Dreadwalker or start a boss fight, we can throw on Fetid Wounds and Deathbrand and then swap back to Nightfall, and then just go start and shooting. Otherwise, it's the same build, still super comfy, still amazing. You're still pushing 9-10k DPS. Highly recommend. Moving on to the swapper setups, of which I originally had 4. The half Sidewinder builds and the traditional shotgun swappers. And we're going to be cutting these and chopping these out. So in the Sidewinder setups, with the loss of damage from Sharpshooter and the changes to some other guns, the Sidewinder setup has kind of fallen behind too much to keep recommending. I mean, you can still push 8-9k DPS, but due to the weird rhythm and the big loss of damage when Sidewinder falls off, I kind of opted just out of those builds, and so I don't really recommend them anymore. I'm going to leave them on the builder page, just know what you're getting into. Now, regarding the traditional shotgun swapper builds with like the scattergun and double barrel, those also kind of fall off a little bit too much just compared to like normally shooting just a shotgun build or a bulldog build or something. So we're not really going to be moving forward these niche playstyles like the shotgun swapper because they don't provide enough DPS to offset the difficulty that they have. Now, Trinity Swapper is just fine. It's actually a little bit better because it got a boost with the recent update by allowing it to dispense the 3 bursts in a slightly faster burst. Like, it basically speeds up our shot swap setup, giving us a little bit more DPS than before. So we're pumping like 11k DPS now with Trinity Swapper, which feels pretty great. So we're going to be keeping that one surprisingly, but the rest, they're all going. Alright, so that was kind of the older range builds we did. A little bit of house cleaning there, and now we get to discuss 2 new builds, which are going to be fairly similar since they're both shotgun builds, because it's the return of the shotguns. We have one for the new and improved Sporebloom, since that monster's back, and they have one for the Bulldog, since it's pretty usable these days. I'm going to start with the Bulldog build, and this is going to be a HuGs Bulldog setup, because who doesn't love to hug Bulldogs, right? I've tried using an Archon Hunter setup to double dip into the crit fragments like you do with the Trinity Swapper, and it just doesn't quite match Gunslinger's reload speed and fire rate, unfortunately, so we're sticking to HuGs here. Hunter's focus is optimal if you can keep it up, so I do recommend running light armor if you want to go that route, or you can just run Hunter's Mark for wall hacks during the transitional areas and boss rush. For Gunslinger, we're going to be running Bulletstorm for the fire rate and the reload speed, but it's not super important. You could run Sidewinder if you want, but I feel like that's only good for a short burst. The setup here is going to be pretty standard for HuGs builds, I feel. We're going to be running Bulldog with Corrosive Rounds and Momentum for crit and crit damage, because we're back on that train. While fire rate and reload speed would sound great on paper, like running Overflow and Bandit or Top Heavy, that's just going to lead you into reloading more and running out of ammo faster, because the Bulldog only carries like 5 clips of ammo, and no amount of reload speed seems to be saving Bulldog, unfortunately. So slower but stronger hits is kind of what we're going for. With that, the handgun we're going to be using is, of course, the Corrupted Rune Pistol, as it's going to be standard for most range builds going forward. And we're going to be using this because of the Death Brand, which grants us our 10% increased damage, and it lasts like 30 seconds, which is great. And we can still get corroded by using Fetid Wounds if you want to go that way, and then put abrasive rounds on the shotgun. And you can put pretty much any mutator on this as well, because we don't necessarily need Fetid Wounds, because we're going to have corrosion on our gun already. Now, we're going to lose some trash clear, obviously, from Nebula, but honestly, Bulldog and Corrupted Rune Pistol are an excellent alternative. They kind of clear through all the boss rush trash pretty easily. For our melee weapon, it doesn't really matter, pick whatever you want. I go with World's Edge and Shocker. Moving on to the trinkets, we're going to go crit, so we're going to have to go back to the old rusty and trusty Abrasive Whetstone for our necklace. We want crit and crit damage so we can maximize each shot we do have, and to go with that, the rings are going to be Braided Thorns for crit, Probability Cord for crit damage, Xania's Malice for weak spot damage, and then again, you could swap that to Burden of the Gambler for bosses if they don't have weak spots. And then finally, we're going to run Outcast Ring for 5% reload speed, which scales up to 25% with each reload. You could also run the Blackout Ring for just a flat 15% reload. Your call, they're pretty even, it's like right there in the middle. Reloading on Bulldog, though, is so rough, you need to remedy that kind of wherever possible. I tried using Gunslinger Charm, which is an amazing neck, by the way, but it actually kind of kills your DPS because you're just going to get to the reload animation faster, and yes, it is faster, but it's just no bueno. You do lose more damage compared to Abrasive Bloodstone. Now, I'm rocking the Profane Heart per the usual for my relic, alongside medium weight, but you might want to drop the lightweight if you're going to use Hunter's Focus. You can do that with Strongback trait or a Dual Steel Ring in place of something else, whatever you want. Then regarding the traits, other than the pretty standard Vigor, Fortify, and in this case Strongback setup, I'm using Handling like the good old days for some recoil and spread control because you're definitely going to need it with the Bulldog. You can also get Potency for increased duration on like Light Extract, Adrenaline, and other consumables. You're going to want Footwork to sidestep more attacks while you're maintaining your DPS, so that's kind of a must. But the rest is pretty much up to you. Chakra, Insight, and Spirit are all good for maintaining your MO mods. Gifted and Expertise is also a good way to go for more skill uptime on bosses and boss rush. And of course, you could just go with Swift and Untouchable. Plenty of options to choose, pick whatever suits your style. Moving on to the Prism. Fairly standard range Prism, we're going to be using Sharpshooter here. Size Matters works, but it's still slightly under in DPS compared to Sharpshooter. And so despite cutting our reloads in half, the loss of damage across all of our ammo, just a little bit too much to get rid of. You're free to run either, but I'd probably change the setup entirely if you're using something like Size Matters. Now, the rest of the Prism, also fairly standard for shotguns. We have Sniper for increased range and ammo, Meta, Gunfighter, and Spread Reduction for our Fragment. The last three loose fragments are going to be crit damage, range, crit chance, and fire rate. So you also can put reload speed on if you want. You can use Tranquil Font for your concoction. I don't really recommend it though, because handling is good enough. But you can also just run more defensive stuff like a Mudtooth Tonic or Darksider or a Barkskin if you want. Or you can run Tranquil Heart and then take off the handling trait and opt for something else. I mean, go for it, all of you. I just don't run it because the reticle, once you get down to like the 0% spread, then it just vanishes. Anyway, that's the Bulldog setup. The build is really easy to play. It's a lot less work than Swapper setups. Basically, you're just running Corrupted Rune Pistol to apply brands and your bleed to trigger your Whetstone, and then you swap the Bulldog and chew out the enemies. Now, Bulldog does feel excellent now, even though it doesn't really quite break 10k DPS all that reliably. It's still good enough to run a dedicated build for, which is a big plus. So, I do want to say I recommend the Bulldog. Give it a try. It's much better now, of course, with the added fire rate, but it does have its downsides, which of course we have to touch up before we continue. Being that this is a standard gun, a lot of the times to get the most out of it, especially on the target range, we need to be using MO mods. Now, all of these MO mods apply element to our weapons, except abrasive rounds. We'll touch on that in just a second. And so when you have an element on your weapon, the bosses that roll elemental resistance are going to completely tank your DPS, and it's going to feel terrible, and that's not good. You can run abrasive rounds, especially because we're going to be running the abrasive Whetstone, and then that fixes it because it's not technically elemental damage and you're good to go. However, there's also a bunch of bosses that can't be bled, like the Astropath and all the bosses from DLC2. So just be very mindful, especially in boss rush when you're using the Bulldog, because it's great on paper, but in practice, not only does it just chew through so much ammo that you're constantly having the ammo box, but if you're like me and every single boss you get is elemental resistance, then you're gonna have a bad time. But I still like it. I'm still making a build with it. Bulldog clears trash great. I still love it, but With that out of the way, let's move on to the next build, which is going to be our Sporebloom setup, which is another shotgun. Now with the Sporebloom, we're still going to be doing pretty much the same build here. We're going to be using HuGs, and we don't really have any other option for this. Sporebloom can't use ammo mods, and you need the reload speed provided by Gunslinger, so you're pretty much stuck to HuGs. Yes, technically you can do like the infinite skill spam wormhole Sporebloom setup, but that's kind of jank, and I don't really like that. So if you're going to do something like that, just run monorail. Anyway, back to HuGs. Sporebloom does have a few options for mutators that work well with it. Obviously, Slayer is good for reload speed and damage, but Momentum actually works out very well for solid crit damage and crit chance, since Sporebloom can actually shoot and reload before the stacks are lost. But also, even though the fire rate of Sporebloom did get nerfed a while back, Bandit still holds up. Granted, it's not exactly reliable, the DPS is all over the place, but when it does work, it works really well. Now, similar to the Bulldog setup, we're going to be using the Corrupted Rune Pistol as our secondary gun, so we can trigger extra damage via brand and fetid wounds, since that's going to be our new go-to for all our range builds. Again, melee weapon, doesn't really matter. For the trinkets, we're going to have different options depending on whether or not you want to go with the Trusted Bandit proc RNG damage, or go for something more stable like Momentum. For the Bandit setup, we're going to be using Gunslinger Charm because 25% reload speed is huge, and the fire rate will come in handy when you get to the Bandit procs, as all those subsequent shots do take your fire rate into consideration. Rest of the rings are going to be the same rings for the Sporebloom Bandit as they were on the Bulldog: Xanias, Braided Thorns, Probability Cord, and Outcast Ring for the reloads. Now, if you want to do less random shooting and more big shooting, you can run Sporebloom with Momentum, in which case you're going to change your neck back to the Abrasive Whetstone for the fat crit damage, and if you're going to go this route, you're going to have to change your Rune Pistol from Fetid Wounds to Twisted Wounds for bleed, or just use a grenade your call, but you're going to need bleed. For the rings, we're going to need to fix the reload speed, so I've opted for both Blackout Ring and the Outcast Ring for 40% reload speed. Never enough though, but it'll do. The two other rings we're going to be using are Braided Thorns for 10% crit, which is going to end us at 85% crit with Hunter's Mark active, and Probability Cord for the crit damage. If you're feeling it, you could also run Wind Hollow Ring for more reload speed, but you're just giving up too much damage at that point. And of course, Xania's Malice is always an option, but I took that off because there's a lot of bosses that don't really have reliable weak spots, so reload speed. For the Prism on Sporebloom, we're using the exact same Prism as on the Bulldog setup, so same general range fragments, same everything. The only difference here is that instead of the fire rate, we're actually going to run reload speed, pretty much because we just need all the reload speed we can get. For the traits, we dropped Chakra for the Bulldog setup, and instead we're going to get Potency on Sporebloom, so we have more consumable uptime, and that's pretty much the only change. Everything else is pretty standard, still going to be using handling and footwork. You could go with either a tanky setup using Fortify and Leech, or go Evasion with Untouchable and Swiftness, your call. Now, Sporebloom actually feels really good to use in Boss Rush because it doesn't quite have limited ammo. Yes, it's only got about 36 rounds when you're running Gunslinger, but honestly, every single round is going to kill something. So you're pretty okay to run through zones and even a boss without having to use an ammo box. But you're still going to have to ammo box eventually. However, even though it does pretty much one-tap everything, there are plenty of monsters like over in Narud that have shields that kinda hit Sporebloom pretty hard because the first shot's just going to take away the shield, and then you have to spend another shot to hit them, and then enemies start piling up, and you're only killing, one every other shot, and it starts feeling pretty bad. But honestly, Corrupted Rune Pistol does a lot of work. Don't feel bad swapping to it, it's great. Now, Sporebloom can push about 12k DPS regularly, where Bulldog sits around 9 to 10k. Obviously, that's going to be optimal, assuming you're hitting all weak spots in optimal range, which isn't realistic, but it should be great for most bosses, and it feels fine. We have an optimal range out to about 18 meters, which is fairly far. Some bosses like Annihilation and Alepsis Tora are going to have issues, but that's about it. Anyway, nothing is really going to touch monorail DPS anytime soon, so it doesn't really matter all that much. However, I do know that Sporebloom is back. It feels great, I love it. I wish the mod was usable still, because it doesn't deal any damage and it doesn't last very long, so it doesn't have too much of a purpose, but either way, Sporebloom is back. It's a great build. Run Sporebloom. And that's pretty much going to be all for me. Those are my two shotgun builds we have for this video, and some updates on our older ones. Long video, sorry, I have a lot of updating to do, so stay tuned for more videos as we go back through some of the other builds, update them, and of course, get into the new builds. And we'll probably move on to mod stuff next, so yeah, stay tuned for that. But yeah, peace, and good luck out there, hunters.